We held him on the radar up to, well, we started getting a lot of sea return, probably around between 8 and 9 miles, and when he got in the sea return, we turned the other radar on, and we really wasn't sure of any definite target after that.
When the Edmund Fitzgerald sailed out of the Duluth Superior Harbor on November 9th, 1975, the weather was pleasant.
If you were there in 1975 on November the 9th, you probably may have been on the golf course. It was that kind of a nice weather for November, but there was a storm brewing up further down south, and it was possible, according to the forecast, that it would hit the bottom part of Lake Superior or the upper Michigan.
When the Fitzgerald left Superior, it was a nice day. I knew there was a storm coming up, but there's storms all the time on Lake Superior.
Those were the voices of Paul Sabrin and L. Andrew Warner, two of the experts we asked to help us understand what was the Edmund Fitzgerald doing out there on November 10th, steaming desperately for Whitefish Bay in the worst weather its captain had ever experienced. In the last episode, we talked about Great Lakes shipping and how the Edmund Fitzgerald spent its record-breaking career as the pride of the American side. In this episode, we'll talk about the circumstances of the Lakers' last voyage. Who was on the boat? What did they know about the weather they might be facing on their way to Detroit? What was the condition of the vessel? Was there anything that might conceivably have been done to avoid the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald? I'm Jay Gabler of the Duluth News Tribune, and this is Edmund Fitzgerald, 50 Years Below. Before its final voyage, the Edmund Fitzgerald loaded up at ore docks near Aloys Bay in Superior, Wisconsin. That was unusual for the Fitzgerald, which had earned the nickname the Toledo Express for its typical route from Silver Bay, Minnesota to Toledo, Ohio. Even back in 1975, the Superior docks had a history stretching back over 8 decades. The first dock there was made of wood and opened in 1892 under the auspices of the Duluth and Winnipeg Railroad. In the 1960s, the Great Northern Railway made Dock No. 1 its first taconite dock. By 1975, the Great Northern Railway had become part of Burlington Northern, which carried the Iron Range taconite that filled the Edmund Fitzgerald on November 9th. Here's Kaylee Matuzak of the Lake Superior Maritime Visitor Center in Duluth, explaining how Lakers like the Fitzgerald were loaded at Dock No. 1.
So in Superior at the docks over at BNSF where the Fitzgerald would have been loading that specific day, it's all gravity fed, so the ore pellets are basically charged into the dock. They have chutes that come down and go over the openings to the cargo holds, the hatches, and then they can fill up the ship that way. There's also conveyor belt loading. Silver Bay had that at the time, but Superior did not. And then for unloading, basically the Fitzgerald didn't have a self-unloader like a lot of the ships have today, like the Anderson has today. So it would have been hewlets, which are basically huge jaws that go over the cargo hold openings for the hatches, go down, take a big bite of the iron ore pellets, and then move them out. So very slow process, but not as slow as doing it by hand, which they had to do back in the day.
Like with shovels?
Yeah, like late 1800s shovels. Ships were smaller though, so it wasn't as much of a headache, but it was still probably a huge headache.
Dock No. 1 was retired in 1988, and although it still stands, it is no longer considered safe to visit. All taconite that comes to the Aloys facility today goes to Dock No. 5, which came online in 1977 and was designed to serve the 1,000-foot vessels that took pride of place from the Fitzgerald-sized ships once known as Super Lakers. The Edmund Fitzgerald's final run was intended to be its last of the season. The planned 2-day run would take the boat east across Lake Superior through the Sioux Locks and down to the National Steel Dock at Zug Island in Detroit. After unloading its cargo, the Fitzgerald would continue on to Toledo, where it would likely spend the winter and receive some needed repairs. It was also going to be the last run for Captain Ernest McSorley, who planned to retire after the voyage. Here's John Bacon, author of the newest book about the Edmund Fitzgerald, The Gales of November.
Obviously, he was the best captain of the Great Lakes. Everyone keeps on saying this from other ships, other places, including guys who served with him. Also, a fundamentally decent man, a deeply decent man, in a way that was not flashy. But the story of Craig Sullivan, how he held up the ship to let a cadet get back on when he didn't have to do that at some personal risk for the company, of course. And, of course, hard-charging guy. He was paid to deliver, and so that's what he did. I also learned only in the last year and a half, maybe two, about his last trip. The incentive for it is a bit of a tack-on trip to pay for his wife's health care. How does that not, it's heartbreaking, undeniable. The whole thing's heartbreaking, but that makes it more so. This guy was a decent man trying to do a decent thing. And all this together, I hate to use the term perfect storm, but it applies here.
Gordon Lightfoot wasn't wrong when he called the ship's captain well-seasoned. Ernest M. McSorley was 63 years old in November 1975, and after 45 years of maritime work, he was ready to retire and spend time with his beloved wife, Nellie, who at the time was in poor health.
Captain McSorley had decades of experience. So, people like to always blame the captain, but he had decades of experience.
That's author L. Andrew Warner. McSorley, the boat's fourth captain, wasn't a showman like his predecessor, Peter Pulser. Pulser was constantly in the news.
The largest cargo of iron ore ever to go through the Sault Ste. Marie lock system will head into the MacArthur Lock in the Michigan Sioux sometime today. A spokesman for the United States Army Corps of Engineers this morning said that the freighter, Edmund Fitzgerald, will be carrying 30,800 tons, a record cargo. The previous record, 29,689 tons, was set by the same ship on its previous trip down the lakes, the spokesman said. Its captain, Peter Pulser, has been shooting for the 30,000 mark for years. He likes a lot of ballyhoo, this fellow. The Sioux Star, July 25th, 1968.
Captain Peter Pulser bosses one of the biggest single pieces of machinery in the Midwest. He is master of the record-breaking Great Lakes ore carrier, Edmund Fitzgerald. So what does a man qualified to run the marvelous Fitzgerald do for a hobby? Build model ships? Or perhaps radios? Or miniature engines? Not on your life. Captain Pulser is maintaining his reputation as a floating amateur disc jockey. When Pulser took command of the new Fitzgerald, he had a large electronic bullhorn erected atop the pilot house. It was fitted with a microphone and a recording console on the bridge of the mighty steamer. He plays music when passing tourist camps on the shores of the St. Mary's River. When the vessel passes within 100 feet of shore and in the early morning, Pulser often will wake the tourists with music and tell them to start their day. Benton Harbor News Palladium, November 20th, 1969.
Wondering if Captain Peter Pulser takes requests? He's the music-loving skipper on the big ore carrier Edmund Fitzgerald, who has the stereo set in his cabin hooked up to the ship's loudspeaker. The music and a few words of greeting are played for the benefit of landlubbers every time the freighter transits the St. Mary's, St. Clair, and Detroit rivers. Duluth News-Tribune, February 1st, 1970.
By contrast, the same newspaper archive sources that turn up a pile of stories about Captain Pulser reveal no stories about Captain McSorley on the Edmund Fitzgerald until, tragically, November 1975. Even in the decades before Ernest McSorley took command of the Fitzgerald in 1972, he rarely made the news. Here's one exception from the Cleveland Press 9 years before the Edmund Fitzgerald launched.
Columbia Transportation Company has been advised by the U.S. Maritime Service Institute of Sheepshead Bay, New York, that Captain James M. Guggenheimer of the steamer Wolverine was the first member of this fleet to complete the correspondence course in radar for deck personnel. Likewise, Columbia is believed to be the first fleet in the Great Lakes area to subscribe to the course. Closely following Captain Guggenheimer across the finish line were 3 officers of Columbia's steamer France. They are Captain Bert Lamberts, Ernest M. McSorley, first mate, and Ronald M. Hansen, third mate. The Cleveland Press, August 2nd, 1949.
The responsible, respected McSorley definitely was not looking for ballyhoo. If you're a Star Trek fan, you might say that Peter Pulser was more of a Captain Kirk, while Ernest McSorley was more of a Captain Picard. If the Fitzgerald had started dropping out of the headlines, though, that's also because by the time McSorley took charge in 1972, it wasn't the King of the Lakers anymore. It was hundreds of feet shorter than the new 1,000-foot vessel Stuart J. Court, and although the Fitzgerald was expected to spend at least another 30 years on the Great Lakes, it was starting to show its age. For all that we don't know about the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, we know a lot about the condition the ship was in on its final run. That's because the vessel's spar deck, or main deck, was actually inspected on October 31st, 1975. Yes, Halloween, just 10 days before it went down. Here's Alandra Warner.
It had been at the end of October before it went out, an inspection to see if it was seaworthy. And then we were talking November, of course. So at the end of October, they found 4 vents that were not properly closing. And they said the Fitzgerald could not sail again until next season they get all that fixed. But they would let them go this time. So that was their last voyage before next year they would have had to fix all that before they got on the water.
The October 31st inspection was a routine part of a regimen designed to take account of any issues with infrastructure, including the massive hatches covering the cargo holds. The inspection happened while the Fitzgerald was unloading in Toledo, so the inspector could take a close look at the hatches while they were open as well as closed. Laker hatches take a lot of wear and tear during service, so it's understandable that they're a focus of safety inspections. The Fitzgerald inspection results, as detailed in a Coast Guard report following the ship's loss, found a number of issues.
The October 31st inspection disclosed discrepancies at number 13 hatch, number 15 hatch, number 16 hatch, and at number 21 hatch. The discrepancy in number 13 hatch was a notch, less than 1 inch in depth, in the inboard edge of the spar deck inner stringer on the port side of the hatch opening, approximately 3 feet aft of the forward combing. The discrepancy in the number 15 hatch was a gouge, less than 1 inch in depth, in the inboard edge of the spar deck inner stringer on the port side of the hatch opening, approximately 3 feet aft of the forward combing. The discrepancy in number 16 hatch consisted of an indentation and a crack in the port hatch girder. The discrepancy in number 21 hatch was a crack in the weld at the intersection of the hatch combing and the hatch end girder on the starboard side, aft. This crack was approximately 1 inch in length. Both the Coast Guard inspector and the ABS surveyor testified that they believed that these 4 discrepancies were typical of damage noted on other ore carriers where dockside offloading equipment was used. U.S. Coast Guard Marine Casualty Report, July 26, 1977.
So, not great, but given that we're talking about a 729-foot ship, you can see where a little crack here and a gouge there might not seem that concerning. The Fitzgerald was cleared to proceed until the end of the 1975 shipping season. The boat had taken a few more dings over the years, including a 1969 grounding near the Soo Locks, a 1970 collision with another bulk carrier, and 3 occasions in the early 1970s when the Fitzgerald bumped into the Soo Locks walls. In September 1974, the crew accidentally started to open a hatch cover before releasing all the clamps that held it shut. The clamps were damaged and later repaired. None of this was that far out of the ordinary for a busy freighter like the Fitzgerald, but it would all seem ominous given what happened on November 10, 1975. Were there problems with the hatches that led to the ship's loss? We'll look much more closely at that question in coming episodes, but right now let's talk about the crew members who were responsible for the ship. As Frederick Stonehouse points out, referencing Captain McSorley and First Mate John McCarthy, for the average person who knows the story of the Fitzgerald, its crew members and their families are essentially faceless.
Yeah, one of the things we often blow by on the Fitzgerald every year is the families. We just kind of forget about them. They were part of the story when the ship went down, and now every year that passes, they just seem to fade away a little deeper and become less of the issue and really less of the focus. And the same thing with the crewmen. We remember the Captain McSorley when we kind of remember McCarthy, and then we kind of fade off from there as they slide on out of our sight. And reality, again, they should be part of this focus. They should be remembered for what they do and how they did it and how they died.
In later episodes, we'll come back to the question of the families and how hard the last 50 years have been for them. For now, let's stay in 1975 and learn more about who the crew members were. In John Bacon's book, The Gales of November, he breaks down the crew list by role. As the author points out, many people, even those close to the tragedy, don't actually know a lot about how 29 men worked together to keep the Fitzgerald humming.
One of the best things I heard was from Deb Champeau. Her dad was Buck Champeau, who was one of the engineers on the ship. She said, I really didn't appreciate, and she's not a teenage girl when he's gone, I didn't really appreciate what my dad did until after he was gone. And I've been gratified even from the family members to hear they actually learned more about what their dads and uncles and cousins and so on did from this book, because it's very hard work. It's, I think, pretty noble work. It's essential work. And as Tanner said, we know the farmer, we know the factory worker, we know the miner. Nobody knows the sailor. And that's where all our stuff comes from.
As Bacon notes in his book, there were 4 officers, including Captain McSorley. 3 of the crew were wheelsmen, the people who actually handled the wheel. 3 were watchmen, who handled duties including lookout and maintenance. 3 were deckhands, utility men, handling a range of tasks. 5 were engineers, maintaining the 7,500 horsepower engine. There were 3 oilers, who did exactly what that job description suggests. 3 crew members were tasked with wiping and maintenance, including taking care of the trash, which Lakers had only recently at that point started incinerating rather than just throwing overboard. Seriously. Then there were 2 porters, 2 cooks, and a cadet, a sailor in training. Cadet David Cowboy Weiss was one of the youngest crew members, along with 21-year-old deckhand Mark Thomas. Weiss was also the only Californian on board the Edmund Fitzgerald. The 1971 high school graduate had been working at a local pet kennel before leaving to study at the Great Lakes Maritime Academy. In 2005, one of Weiss's Maritime Academy classmates, Dean Hobbs, told the Ventura County Star that Weiss earned his nickname, Cowboy, quote, because he liked to wear mirrored shades, a big belt buckle, and a black Stetson. According to his classmate, Weiss became hooked on Laker life during a visit to Chicago, where he was on Navy Pier when he saw a freighter passing by and thought that might be, quote, the life for him. Captain McSorley was the oldest man on the Fitzgerald, but there were 4 more crew members in their 60s. One of them was 62-year-old Bob Rafferty, the steward. In other words, the cook. Although Gordon Lightfoot didn't name any names in his song The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, a man referred to as, quote, the old cook is the only person to have direct quotes in the song. Quote, fellas, it's too rough to feed ya. And then, quote, fellas, it's been good to know ya. Remembered as a jovial man, Rafferty had only been on the Fitzgerald since October 1975, so recently that his stepson later said he didn't realize his stepfather was on the ship when news broke about its loss. The stepson said he and other family members, quote, kept waiting and waiting for the good news that Rafferty was safe. It never came. In 2000, Rafferty's daughter told the Wichita Eagle she thought her dad would love Lightfoot's song, although the cultural ubiquity of the Edmund Fitzgerald was sometimes hard. When a coworker jokingly referred to something as having, quote, sunk like the Edmund Fitzgerald, she had to tell him quietly, my dad was on that ship. Bruce Lynn, director of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum, said the museum has been working to personalize the crew's stories.
We have a scrolling video that shows pictures of every single one of the crew members. And when I started, we didn't really have that. We had a list of names, and a lot of us thought we had pictures of most of the crew members, but let's see if we can't get pictures of all the crew members. And that took a little while. But then it's also part of this video now where we have scenes of the ship when it was sailing, clearly happier days when it was being launched. But then, intermixed with that, we have pictures of the crewman itself. So I think many, if not all, the Fitzgerald family members have come to truly appreciate keeping that memory alive of their loved ones. Let's say there's one crewman and we have 6 or 7 family members at a memorial ceremony, the one that we do each November. And you hear them starting to talk about, say, a picture of that loved one of theirs, and you might see a car in the background, and you might see a house in the background, and let's say it's Alan Cowman, and he's standing beside that car, and suddenly the rest of the Cowman family starts talking, I remember that was Thanksgiving in 1971. He had just gotten that car. He was so proud of that car. And then they start laughing, and they start talking more and more about who he was as a person. Same way with Bruce Hudson as another example. Bruce Hudson, oddly, he and I we have a few things in common. I went to Ohio State, he was going to Ohio State. I was an avid motorcycle rider, he was into them. I have a Dodge Challenger, he had a Dodge Challenger. Unfortunately, it was waiting at the dock for him and his crew, and one of his good buddies on the ship, Mark Thomas, they were gonna do a cross-country trip in that Challenger. Little things like that when you talk to either, for example, Bruce's cousin or his mom before she passed away, suddenly that crewman comes alive for us, and we feel like in some ways we get to know them a little bit.
Yes, the Edmund Fitzgerald crew members were all men. Women crew members on Great Lakes freighters, especially outside the galley, were essentially non-existent in 1975, although that would begin to change by the end of the decade. Even today, women remain a small minority of crew members on both Lakers and Salties. Here's Kaylee Matuzak.
There's definitely more women working on Lakers today. Still not like a whole heck of a lot, but especially like on the Canadian side, like I think they have a couple of female captains. There's definitely women working on most of the freighters that we see coming in and out. Yeah, so I mean, the general politics of the 70s will probably tell you why there weren't women working in too many of those manual jobs. But yeah, there definitely are more nowadays.
Author L. Andrew Warner's father was not on the Edmund Fitzgerald, but growing up with him taught her something about the ways of the maritime trades.
My father was a mariner. He was a chief engineer in Europe, and before we came to Canada. And there's some times you're gone for months at a time, and that takes a special kind of person to do that. You know, you're not seeing your family. You're not having a routine of a normal life. I know one of the times he was gone for about 8 months, and that's a long time. And I think they take the weather that comes. I mean, it's a dangerous thing. Captain Eric Wood, who is mentioned in the book as well, and he says that if you go on to the lake, it can be nice and beautiful, and then there's a huge storm. And if Superior wants to take you, Mother Nature will take you, which means you're to the elements.
On November 9th, 1975, the entire crew was looking forward to the end of the shipping season, a relatively early end given that Lakers would sometimes keep sailing into the new year. They might have been able to catch some R&R in Superior while waiting for the Fitzgerald to load, but they would not have wanted to miss the boat. Here's John Bacon referencing the Arthur M. Anderson, a ship we'll learn more about in the next episode.
The heartbreaking part for me is how happy they were. That the guys on the Anderson, just, as you know, half an hour up the road in Two Harbors. Well, they got 2 months left. They're at the Legion Hall, of course, right there in Two Harbors. But they know they got 2 months left, so they'll tip a few, but they're not going to celebrate anything. The guys on the Edmund Fitzgerald got along unusually well, as you know. They were very close. No real arguments to speak of that anyone can recall who worked for those guys. And they know that because of McSorley's wife, because of repairs that needed to be done, they got 2 days left. This is their last run. This is it. And so they're feeling very good about it, and they got a very unusual 4-month off instead of 2.5 months or so in the winter. They're looking forward to spending that with their families. One guy, Lane Wilhelm, was going to finally take the engineer's test and try to beat that thing. And the weather was gorgeous. The weather was, you live in Duluth, man. How many November 8ths is it 70 degrees? Not very many. You might not have seen one. So these guys, the weather's beautiful. We're in a great mood. It's been a great season. They broke more of their records, and they've got, 4 months off coming up, and they're saying goodbye to each other, basically. The heartbreaking thing is just how, as I said, it's as good as it gets. And November 8th really was. So, sad stuff.
As Beyond the Breakers podcast co-host Tanner Johnson pointed out, the Fitzgerald crew members were working men who were doing their jobs.
Studying the crew list on the Fitzgerald and, seeing just where these guys were from and just kind of seeing some of the variety and seeing the sort of, it isn't all, disguised from Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan. Obviously, that makes up a good portion of it, but I think there is a surprising variety. And then also, I think the range of ages is always interesting, on the Fitz, like any other vessel. You have guys who are really, really young, guys in their early 20s. Then you've got crew who are all the way up into the, their 50s and sometimes into their 60s. And I think it gives you an insight into the various sort of reasons that might bring someone to be on the crew of one of these ships, where they are in their lives. Shipwreck enthusiasts, shipwreck nerds, we kind of romanticize, the sea, the lakes, and doing this job. And, kind of like you mentioned earlier, it's not a glamorous job. It's not a job that would be, people would be necessarily lining up to do. It doesn't typically, win you a lot of glory. You might only make the news if something goes wrong. But like anything else, it is a job, and these are humans, and they have, various, attitudes toward what they're doing. And I think it helps to remember that this is, to us, what is this tragic mystery was a day at work for these guys. No one necessarily wants to go to work thinking that they're going to be immortalized in song, because that probably doesn't bode well for you.
This brings us to the point when Captain McSorley prepared to set out on his scheduled ore run, his last scheduled ore run, even as a storm was brewing. As mentioned at the beginning of this episode, the weather in the Twin Ports was fair. What did Captain McSorley know about the weather he was potentially about to face on the other side of the lake? Here's L. Andrew Warner again.
When the Fitzgerald left Superior, it was a nice day. I knew there was a storm coming up, but there's storms all the time on Lake Superior. And not a concern. These captains, especially Captain McSorley and Captain Cooper of the Anderson, had been through many storms. They knew how to handle them. So, we're aware of it, but not changing anything.
On November 9th, we now know from information that was not available to Captain McSorley, 2 storm systems were converging on the eastern end of Lake Superior. At the time, the National Weather Service was predicting a storm, but nothing out of the ordinary for November on Lake Superior. Captain McSorley really didn't know much more than that. Here's Frederick Stonehouse speaking first about ships in the present day.
Every company or every ship before it departs port, and I believe the day before departure is scheduled, receives a complete weather workup from the Weather Service. Every ship on the lakes. That's how seriously they take it in the commitment of time, and they do a very good job with it. If you were to roll this back to 1913, though, it was even worse. When the total weather forecasting unit was the flag flying at the end of the breakwaters they left on their downbound or upbound trip, they literally had nothing to go on, but quite literally the seaman sense of what would be occurring within the forecasting realm. And of course, we know the outcome to that, 250 dead sailors, 47 wrecked ships, and 9 of them being modern freighters. So you could say by Fitzgerald time, they've come a long way, but they had a very long way to go.
If any of the Fitzgerald crew members happened to pick up a copy of the November 9th, 1975 Duluth News-Tribune, they would have seen front-page stories about President Gerald Ford's re-election bid, about the shortage of legal aid on the Iron Range, and about how, quote, the metric system of measurement is on the way for the United States. The Sunday newspaper offered weather forecasts for the Twin Ports, northern Minnesota, Minnesota in general, Wisconsin, and upper Michigan, where the Fitzgerald was headed. Here was the forecast for upper Michigan.
Occasional rain likely through tonight, turning colder Monday. Lows this morning in low 30s and low 40s. Highs today in mid 40s to near 50. Lows Monday morning in low 30s and low 40s. Highs Monday in upper 30s and mid 40s. Duluth News-Tribune, November 9th, 1975.
That was it. Here's University of Minnesota Duluth scientist Jay Austin talking about why Lake Superior storms are so hard to forecast even today.
There can be that sort of strong spatial variability in these systems, which is one of the reasons that we put equipment out. So my lab operates meteorological buoys out on Lake Superior in the Western Arm specifically. And so I work with the Weather Service, and their number one thing is we need more stuff out there because just because you know what the conditions are, near Stony Point doesn't mean you necessarily know what the conditions are in Two Harbors. And so one of the reasons that there are buoys, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration operates 3 platforms on Lake Superior. The closest to us is basically just south of Grand Marais. Those platforms only started operating in about 1979 in response to the fact that there wasn't a lot of meteorological data over the lake, which meant it was very difficult to do forecasts. And so really, the Fitzgerald disaster was, in some people's mind, the main impetus behind a better instrumentation or instrumenting Lake Superior and the other Great Lakes better. In fact, there weren't any open lake buoys, to my knowledge, until 1979, 1980, in response to that disaster. And now there are dozens and dozens and dozens, including 3 operated by UMD.
It would have been difficult, even impossible, for Captain McSorley to guess that he was about to steam into the worst storm and the last storm of his life. To the extent he had any indication that a system was brewing, he would not have been inclined to wait it out. As author John Bacon learned while researching his book, even if McSorley wasn't as flashy as Peter Pulser, he wasn't afraid to drive his vessel hard.
I knew a bit about the guy. I knew a bit about the story. I had no idea that this was A, the last run of the season, and B, almost certainly his last run, and probably about half a dozen guys on that ship as well. So that obviously raises the stakes quite a bit. That changes, if you're asking for the headspace, that's got to change everything. And I wonder, we can only guess, I wonder if that in some ways he made some uncharacteristic decisions, and not radical ones. He made conservative ones, which he's not known for. And sadly, ironically, perhaps at the exact wrong time. The decision to to slow down, the decision to take the northern route. These were utterly uncharacteristic of him. And he had his normal hard-charging mindset. I think they get there. I think they get there, frankly, without too much problem.
The captain of a boat works for the shipping company and knows he'll be accountable for the ore that does or does not get moved. Here's Frederick Stonehouse.
I mean, you're the company man. You're the only company man on that boat. Everybody else is a union member, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it does put you in the difficult position of being the sole manager of the vessel.
Anyone who's familiar with Gordon Lightfoot's song remembers how much ore the Fitzgerald was loaded with on November 9th, 1975. David James Carlson leads a Gordon Lightfoot tribute band, and he's had a lot of opportunity to reflect on the significance of that number.
As in the song, it says 26,000 tons more. It weighed 26,000 tons more than the Edmund Fitzgerald weighed empty. 13,000 tons plus was the weight of the Fitzgerald itself. So put them together, you have 40,000 tons buoyantly sailing across the water?
In the last episode, we talked about the fact that the Fitzgerald and other Lakers had been approved to carry increasingly large loads, so the ship sat lower and lower in the water. When we think about the decisions that were made leading up to the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, it's not just about the decision to set out on that run. It's about the decision to load the boat so heavily, even late in the season when the weather is notoriously bad. Freeboard is the distance between the waterline and the ship's deck. Between 1958 and 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald's summertime freeboard requirement didn't change much, from about 12.5 feet to about 11 feet. On the other hand, the wintertime freeboard requirement, which applied in November, was reduced from just shy of 15 feet down to just 11.5 feet. In other words, by 1975, the Fitzgerald was allowed to ride lower in winter than it had originally been allowed to ride in summer. Laker crews learned how to game even the relaxed standards to squeeze more ore on board. This is known as cheating the plimsoll line, or finding ways to manipulate the load to keep the line showing how low the vessel can go, just barely above the water. Here's John Bacon.
And Mark Twain said, you don't develop a bad habit overnight. You get coaxed down the steps to the basement one by one until finally you find yourself on the bottom floor. One of my editors gave me a great line. He said, they're always putting on a few more tons of taconite, a few more tons, which is, he's got to put on, of course, 58 million pounds of stuff. Well, they keep on cheating the plimsoll line, how low you're supposed to go. And of course, the standards change incredibly, more than a yard. That's crazy. And there's no reason for this. The ship was not built for that. That's not these guys' fault. And it's not even cheating a few inches here and there. That's, again, 3 feet plus. It's crazy, but they're going 2 miles over the speed limit and 2 miles more, 2 miles more. At what point is it unsafe? It's so hard to draw that line, literally in this case. And I don't blame the guys. That's what they're supposed to be doing on this thing. And all the other ships are doing the same thing pretty much. But that's one big, literally straws on a camel's back, almost literally. That's one that you see coming and you go, oh no, you're messing with the fates. And then you're doing some other things with the fates and the weather is not good. And we're going to go anyway, and we go too fast. And this is one thing after another after another. You've got all these safety nets that get pulled back one by one by one. And if you had half of them, you'd probably be okay. But you got rid of all of them pretty much. And nature also did that as well. So it's just sad to see the mindset that we got away with it, we're okay. And one of the great lines I got from one of the professors you saw is, you don't know, a shipwreck is a binary occasion, a binary event. You never know how close you are to the edge until you're over it. It's me walking around with a blindfold around the Grand Canyon. If I got a blindfold on, I don't know how close I was 2 feet from going over. If I go over, it's all of it. I'm dead. If I walk back, I think that was nothing. Take the blindfold off. And that's what they kept doing.
We asked author Frederick Stonehouse whether there was any possibility that Captain McSorley might have called off the Fitzgerald's final voyage.
Could it, in theory, have happened? Yes. Did it in practicality happen? Of course not, because the ships are there to earn money. They do not earn money sitting in port. So it's the cargo carrying capacity that makes them so valuable. That said, the real culprit here that I think is often not discussed is how abysmally bad the weather forecasting was. This was Neanderthal forecasting via I don't know what, through pigeons with a message tied around their legs. They were doing all the message consolidation in Chicago. So all the forecasting on the Great Lakes ended up in Chicago. They rolled it around, put some pixie dust on it, and eventually sent it to Washington and eventually distributed it to the Lakers. There were some captains that didn't like that. because they felt that from a forecasting point of view, it was truly abysmal. So they did their own. And captains like Dudley Paquette on the Winifred Sykes, for example, was famous for doing his own forecasting. And that means getting the facsimiles sent to the ship and him actually doing the workups with time and temperature barometrics, what the weather's going to do, and really doing what the forecasters should have been doing. But in their stead, in their defense, the only group that after the Fitzgerald sank really stepped up and said, we have a problem and we can fix it with the Weather Bureau. And today we've got something like the 20 plus weather buoys on the Great Lakes, recording buoys on the Great Lakes. Big ones, small ones, fat ones, skinny ones, all different missions to them, but they really are out there doing their job. Where by contrast, everybody else just kind of threw their hands up and walked away from the Fitzgerald disaster.
At 2:15 p.m. on November 9th, 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald departed the Duluth Superior Harbor through the Superior Entry. As the ship sailed east, presses rolled on the next day's Duluth News-Tribune with a front-page weather box saying that, quote, winter promises to pack its first punch of the season today. In the next episode, we'll follow the Fitzgerald, accompanied by a ship that's still afloat today, the Arthur M. Anderson, across Lake Superior and into the storm. Edmund Fitzgerald, 50 Years Below is a production of the Duluth News-Tribune. This podcast is written and narrated by Jay Gabler, with audio engineering by Wyatt Buckner and Dan Williamson. The audio of this episode was edited by Wyatt Buckner. Our editors on this project are Katie Rohman and Barrett Chase, and our executive editor is Rick Lubbers. Original score composed by William Brueggemann. Newspaper archive excerpts and other historical documents were read by Teri Cadeau, Barrett Chase, and Dan Williamson. Thanks to our guests on this episode: L. Andrew Warner, Jay Austin, John U. Bacon, David James Carlson, Tanner Johnson, Bruce Lynn, Kaylee Matuzak, Paul Sabrin, and Frederick Stonehouse. Read more stories about the Edmund Fitzgerald and learn more about this podcast at DuluthNewsTribune.com.